The massive glass windows of the mansion stretched floor to ceiling, their pristine surfaces catching the pale, cold light of the March day. Sunlight spilled into the room, softening over the polished marble floors and ornate decor, casting a delicate glow that seemed to cradle the space in an illusion of serenity. Yet, beneath this tranquil facade, Theodora's soul churned with restless energy. She sat at an intricately carved desk, her slender fingers twirling a golden fountain pen, its weight a small comfort in her hand. Her dark eyes lingered on the invitation she'd just finished crafting, each detail a testament to her meticulous nature. The paper was thick and creamy, sourced from a premium artisan supplier, its edges adorned with subtle golden embossing that gleamed faintly in the light. The font, elegant, looping cursive, whispered of refinement and control. Everything about it screamed success, status, and a life carefully curated. But there was more to it than met the eye. Theodora's lips pressed into a thin line as she traced the name on the envelope with her gaze. Penelope Vance. The woman her fiancé, Casper, had once loved. The woman he'd walked away from 6 years ago, chasing ambition over affection. Theodora tilted her head slightly, her auburn hair catching the light as she considered the weight of what she held. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a statement. A quiet but deliberate flex of power. The words inside were simple yet pointed, written in Casper's name as tradition demanded. I invite you to share in the joy of my wedding. Theodora had penned them herself, her handwriting steady despite the storm brewing within her. She could almost picture Penelope opening it, her brow furrowing as she read the gilded lines. Did she still think of him? Did she wonder what might have been? Theodora's grip tightened on the pen for a moment before she set it down with a soft clink against the desk. She leaned back in her chair, the silk of her dress rustling faintly, and let out a slow breath. He's not that man anymore, she murmured to herself, her voice low and firm, as if saying it aloud could cement the truth. The Casper Penelope had known, the uncertain young dreamer who balked at commitment, was long gone. In his place stood a titan, a businessman with a string of thriving companies, a millionaire who commanded boardrooms and bent the world to his will. Theodora had seen the transformation up close, had stood by him as he climbed, and now she'd be the one at his side when he reached the pinnacle. Theodora was ambition incarnate, a striking figure carved from the glittering upper echelons of New York society. She moved through life with the poise of someone born to it, tall and elegant, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that could cut through a room like a blade. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her mind that made her formidable. She understood the unwritten rules of the high-stakes business world as if they'd been etched into her bones. Alliances were currency, appearances were power, and hesitation was weakness. To Casper she was a perfect fit, a partner who mirrored his own relentless drive. He felt at ease with her in a way he hadn't with anyone else. Theodora was a tigress, fierce and passionate, yet deliberate and unshakably dependable. Every move she made was calculated, every smile a weapon, and she wielded both with the precision of a master. Together, they were a force. In the eyes of the elite, the deal-makers, the power brokers, the ones who shaped the world from corner offices and private clubs, their relationship was a textbook success. They had it all: wealth, influence, and a shared vision that burned brighter with every step they took. After months of dating, the decision to marry felt less like a romantic whim and more like the natural next move in a well-played game. A union that would fuse their individual triumphs into something even greater, an empire perhaps. It was perfect. Almost. Theodora paced the length of the study now, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, the invitation to Penelope still resting on the desk like a loaded gun. For months, a splinter of unease had lodged itself deep in her chest, sharp and persistent, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She'd built her life on control, on knowing every angle, anticipating every outcome, but this was different. This wasn't a rival she could outmaneuver or a deal she could close. It was Penelope. The ghost of Casper's past, a name that lingered in the air between them like a faint, unwelcome perfume. She hated that it gnawed at her, this small, irrational doubt. Casper had chosen her, hadn't he? He'd built this life with her. And yet, the thought of Penelope, soft-edged and untested, a relic of a simpler time, refused to fade. Theodora's fingers curled into her palms. She wasn't jealous, she told herself. Jealousy was for the weak. This was something else, something closer to pride, to possession. She'd fought too hard, climbed too high, to let a shadow from years ago dim what was hers. That day, the sleek black S-Class hummed softly as it idled at the red light, its tinted windows shielding Casper and Theodora from the world outside. They were on their way back from another lavish escape. Casper sat in the back seat, the buttery leather creaking faintly under his weight. He was dressed impeccably, as always, a tailored Tom Ford suit hugging his frame, the crisp white shirt beneath unbuttoned just enough to hint at ease amid the opulence. His cufflinks glinted as he rested his arm against the door, staring out the window with a distant, pensive look. The city blurred past in shades of grey, but his mind was elsewhere, sifting through the life he'd built. He had it all. The thought came to him unbidden, steady and sure. The cars, gleaming machines that purred at his command. The mansion, a monument to his success, its halls echoing with the kind of quiet only money could buy. And Theodora sitting beside him, her presence as commanding as ever. She was beautiful, sharp, and wealthy in her own right, a partner who didn't just keep up but pushed him further. He'd climbed every mountain he'd once dreamed of, and now he stood at the summit, looking down at a world he'd conquered. It should have been enough. A low rumble broke his trance as a hulking delivery truck, its sides plastered with faded ads, shifted out of the way. Beyond it, a small playground came into view, nestled in the heart of a modest park across the street. The grass was patchy, the swings swaying gently in the breeze, and there, in the middle of it all, a young couple darted after a little boy. The child's laughter carried faintly through the glass, high and wild, as he toddled ahead, his tiny legs pumping with reckless joy. The man scooped him up mid-run, spinning him in the air while the woman clapped her hands, her face lit with a grin. Casper's breath caught. He watched them, transfixed, as something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. A pang, soft but insistent, like a string plucked out of tune. For a fleeting moment he saw himself there. Not in the suit, not in the car, but out on that patchy grass, chasing a little boy with his own eyes, his own laugh. The image was so vivid it startled him, his hands lifting a child into the air, the weight of small arms around his neck, the sound of unrestrained giggles filling his ears. He blinked, his throat tightening. When had he last thought about something like that? He'd spent years chasing deals, not dreams of a family, and yet, there it was, unbidden and undeniable, tugging at a part of him he'd buried beneath ambition. "Casper, did you hear me?" Theodora's voice sliced through the quiet, crisp and expectant. She sat beside him, her tablet balanced on her lap, a manicured finger poised over the screen. "The meeting tomorrow with the Carver Group, it's critical. We need to lock in their investment, and that means a flawless pitch. I've already prepped the slides, but we should run through the numbers tonight." He didn't turn to her right away. His gaze lingered on the playground as the light turned green, the car easing forward and stealing the scene from view. "Yeah," he mumbled, his voice rougher than he intended. "I heard you." Theodora's brow arched, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Are you listening, though? You've got that look again, like you're a million miles away." Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it, a subtle prod that demanded his attention. "I'm fine," he said, forcing his focus back to her. He offered a faint smile, the kind he knew she'd accept, and leaned back in his seat. Just tired from the trip. Let's go over the numbers when we get home. The mansion was quiet that evening, save for the soft hum of the central heating and the occasional clack of Theodora's fingers against her laptop keys. She sat in the study, bathed in the warm glow of a brass desk lamp, her posture straight and focused as she reviewed the pitch for tomorrow's meeting. The room smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, a sanctuary of order and purpose. Caspar appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. He leaned against the frame, hands shoved into the pockets of his slacks, the top button of his shirt undone. His sigh broke the silence, heavy and deliberate, like the prelude to something he'd been holding back too long. Theodora didn't look up right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, but the rhythm of her typing slowed, a sign she'd registered his presence. "You're hovering," she said, her voice cool and measured, not quite an invitation. He shifted his weight, the floor creaking faintly under him. "We need to talk," he said, his tone low but firm. "About something real for once." That got her attention. She lifted her gaze, her hazel eyes narrowing as they met his. "If it's about the Carver pitch, I've got it handled. You just need to—" "It's not about the pitch." He cut her off, stepping into the room now, his hands slipping out of his pockets. "It's about us. About kids." The word landed like a stone between them. Theodora's expression froze, her lips parting slightly before pressing into a tight, controlled line. She set the laptop aside with deliberate care, folding her hands in her lap as if bracing herself. "Caspar," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "We've been over this. You promised me you wouldn't bring it up again." "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck, pacing a few steps before stopping near the window. The curtains were drawn, but he stared at them anyway, as if he could see through to the night beyond. "I know what I said, but I can't keep pretending it doesn't matter. I saw something today, out there, in the car. A family, a kid. And it hit me, Theo. What if that's what I want?" Theodora's laugh was sharp, a brittle sound that cut through the tension. "What you want?" She stood, smoothing the front of her silk blouse, her movements precise and controlled. "Since when does Caspar Langston want a picket fence and a sandbox? We built this," she gestured around the room to the life they'd carved out, "because we agreed. No distractions, no detours. Kids are a liability to everything we've worked for." "They don't have to be," he shot back, turning to face her. His voice rose, edged with frustration he'd kept bottled too long. "Maybe I'm tired of living like every day's a damn board meeting. Maybe I want something that's not about profit margins or power plays." She crossed her arms, her gaze hardening. "Then what? You want to trade all this for a minivan and diaper runs? That's not you, Caspar. That's never been you." He hesitated, his jaw working as he searched for the words. Then, almost without meaning to, he said it. Penelope thought differently. She wanted that life, kids, a family. She wasn't afraid of it. The air in the room shifted, charged with something electric and dangerous. Theodora's eyes widened for a split second before narrowing into slits. She took a step toward him, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Penelope!" Another laugh, this one colder, more cutting. "Oh, that's rich. You're dragging her into this? Tell me, Caspar, if she was so perfect, why'd you divorce her? Why'd you walk away from her little fairy tale dream?" He flinched, her words hitting their mark. He trailed off, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I was different then. I thought the same way you do, that a family would hold me back. That ambition was everything. But maybe I was wrong." Theodora shook her head, a mocking smile tugging at her lips. "No, you weren't wrong. You were smart. You chose this." She swept her arm again, encompassing the mansion, their empire. "Over that. And now you're standing here, what? Regretting it? Fantasizing about some quaint little life you never wanted until 5 minutes ago?" I'm not saying I regret it, he snapped, his voice rough with emotion. I'm saying I'm allowed to wonder, to feel something different. Feel whatever you want, she said, turning back to her desk, her tone icing over. But don't expect me to play along. This is who we are, Casper. If you don't like it, that's on you. She sat down, pulling the laptop back toward her as if the conversation were over, but the tension lingered, thick and unresolved, hanging between them like a storm waiting to break. Theodora had always known about Penelope. The name had surfaced early in their relationship, slipping out in casual anecdotes Casper probably didn't even realize he'd shared. A fleeting mention of a college sweetheart, a laugh about some old memory, quickly brushed aside. But Theodora noticed. She'd pieced it together over time. Penelope was the one who'd almost tethered him to a different life, the one he'd left behind when he chose the path that led to her. And though she'd never met the woman, Theodora hated her with a quiet, simmering intensity. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the idea of her, the soft-edged shadow she cast over Casper's past that gnawed at Theodora's pride. The fight had left a bitter taste in the air. After Casper's voice had softened and he'd stepped closer, rubbing a hand over his face, he'd muttered an apology. "I didn't mean to come at you like that," he said, his tone rough but sincere. "I was too harsh. I don't know, Theo. I got caught up in my head." Theodora looked up from her laptop, her expression smoothing into a practiced smile, tight at the edges but warm enough to pass. "It's fine," she said, her voice lilting with a forgiveness she didn't fully feel. "We're both tired. Let's just put it behind us." She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly over his arm, a gesture meant to soothe. He nodded, exhaling as if relieved, and left the study with a quiet, "Good night." But as the door clicked shut, Theodora's smile faded. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the golden pen still resting on the desk, its gleam catching the lamplight. Her mind churned, replaying his words. Penelope thought differently, and the way they'd landed like a slap. He'd apologized, sure, but the damage was done. That name, that comparison, had lit a fuse in her she couldn't ignore. She wasn't about to let it fester, though. No, Theodora didn't stew in resentment. She acted. A plan took shape, sharp and deliciously spiteful. She'd already drafted the invitation, hadn't she? That elegant little card addressed to Penelope Vance, sitting innocently on the desk like a loaded die. She'd send it, oh yes, but it wouldn't just be an invitation. It would be a stage, a grand, glittering platform to remind Penelope, and everyone else, exactly where she stood. Theodora pictured it. Penelope arriving at the wedding, perhaps in some modest dress that screamed middle-class nostalgia, her eyes wide as she took in the extravagance, the chandeliers dripping with crystal, the champagne towers, the sea of influential guests in bespoke suits and couture gowns. And Theodora, radiant in her custom gown, would be the gracious hostess, all smiles and charm, orchestrating every moment to ensure Penelope felt small, out of place, a relic Casper had outgrown. She could already hear herself, her voice honeyed and cutting as she greeted her. "Oh, Penelope, how sweet of you to come. It's been so long since Casper's. Simpler days, hasn't it?" A laugh light and tinkling, just enough to draw eyes. Maybe she'd arrange for a toast, something subtle but pointed. To new beginnings, and leaving the past where it belongs. She'd watch Penelope's face, savor the flush of embarrassment, the realization that she was a guest in a world she'd never belonged to. Theodora picked up the invitation, running her thumb over the embossing again, her lips curling into a faint, predatory smirk. "Let's see how different you really are," she murmured to the empty room. She'd make sure Penelope's presence was a footnote, a quiet humiliation played out in front of everyone who mattered. Casper might have stirred the pot, but Theodora would finish it, and she'd do it with style. The New York office lay hushed in the stillness of pre-dawn, the sprawling window behind Casper's desk framing a city just beginning to stir. The grey light seeped in, brushing the glass skyscrapers with strokes of silver and shadow, softening their jagged edges. Caspar sat in his high-backed leather chair, the faint creak of it the only sound as he shifted, a stack of old photographs splayed across the desk. His fingers moved mechanically, flipping through them one by one, each image a relic he'd meant to burn a dozen times over but could never bring himself to destroy. His breath hitched as he paused on one. Penelope, 6 years younger, her head tilted back in laughter, sunlight weaving golden threads through her chestnut hair. Her eyes sparkled with a warmth he hadn't seen in ages. They were different then. Younger, softer, brimming with a reckless kind of hope. He leaned back, the photo trembling slightly in his hand as memories flooded the sterile office, filling the corners with echoes of a life he'd buried. They'd met at university, two opposites drawn together like magnets. Penelope was in the School of Education, a quiet force with a steely determination to shape young minds, her notebooks always stuffed with lesson plans and ideals. Caspar was the restless one, a business major with big dreams and bigger energy, already sketching out logos for companies that didn't yet exist. Their romance had ignited fast and fierce, a collision of his relentless drive and her steady gentleness. She'd been his anchor, he'd been her spark, and for a while it felt like nothing could touch them. Those early years were a blur of magic. Late-night dates in the city's heart, weaving through crowded streets to hole-in-the-wall diners, splitting plates of greasy fries as they talked over each other about their futures. She'd lean across the table, her chin in her hand, listening to him ramble about his latest idea with a smile that said she believed in him more than he dared to. "You're going to change the world, Cass," she'd say, her voice soft but certain, and he'd laugh it off, but her faith stuck with him. She saw past the ambition, saw the sensitive dreamer beneath, the one who'd stay up with her watching old movies, his arms slung around her shoulders as they whispered about the house they'd buy one day, the kids they'd raise. They got married in a small ceremony, just close friends and family, her in a simple white dress that made his chest ache, and they'd started building that bright future together. Penelope had been the perfect wife in ways he hadn't deserved. She listened, really listened, her hazel eyes locked on his as he vented about another failed venture, another investor who'd walked away. She'd stayed through it all, the late nights and the losses, her hand on his shoulder as he cursed at spreadsheets, her voice calm as she said, "We'll figure it out. We always do." And they had. One of his last ideas, a scrappy little startup they'd brainstormed together over coffee-stained notebooks, finally caught fire. An investor bit. The business took root, and then it grew fast and wild, like a weed breaking through concrete. But with the growth came a shift, slow and insidious. The late-night dates turned into late-night meetings. Family dinners became quick hellos over takeout before he disappeared into his office again. Conversations shrank to logistics. Schedules, bills, a clipped, "How was your day?" That didn't wait for an answer. Caspar threw himself into the world of numbers and contracts, chasing opportunities like they were oxygen, while Penelope faded into the background of his life. She didn't complain, not at first. She'd wait up for him, curled on the couch with a book, offering a tired smile when he stumbled in past midnight. She thought it was a phase, that he'd see the balance eventually, realize family mattered as much as the empire he was building. The kids' conversation was the real fracture. She'd bring it up gently at first, testing the waters. A quiet, "What if we started trying soon?" Over breakfast, her tone hopeful. He'd brush it off with a laugh. "Not yet, Pen." Timing's off. She'd nod, trusting him, but as the business swelled, his deflections grew sharper. "We can't right now, too much on the line," he'd snap, shutting it down before it could breathe. She stopped agreeing, her patience thinning as the years stretched on, and he stopped listening altogether, dodging the topic like a live wire. The bigger the business got, the deeper he buried that part of himself, the part she'd once believed in, and the wider the gulf between them grew. The last time they'd truly talked, really laid it all bare, was on a dreary late autumn afternoon. A light drizzle streaked the windows of the small cafe where they sat, the air thick with the scent of damp coats and burnt coffee. Penelope's hands were wrapped around a chipped mug, her fingers tracing the rim as she stared into the steam. Caspar sat across from her, his jaw tight, one leg bouncing under the table. The hum of other conversations filled the space, but between them the silence was suffocating until she broke it. "Do you realize your ambitions are killing us?" Her voice was quiet but steady, her eyes lifting to meet his, searching for something she hadn't seen in months. He didn't hesitate. "It's called growth," he shot back, his tone icy, clipped, like he was explaining a balance sheet to a stranger. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, daring her to argue. She didn't respond right away. Her lips parted, then closed, a flicker of hurt crossing her face before she masked it. To him, in that moment, it was just another disagreement, another hurdle to push past on his way to the top. Success was the only metric that mattered. Relationships, even theirs, were secondary, negotiable. But to Penelope, it was a wall, cold, unyielding, built brick by brick with every late night, every dismissed conversation. She'd tried to chip away at it, hammering at it with patience, with pleas, with love, but the cracks never widened. After months of fighting to reach him, she was exhausted, her resolve fraying. The breaking point came later, not in that cafe but in the dim light of their apartment a few weeks after. Another argument about kids, her voice rising with a rare edge. "I'm not asking for the world, Caspar, just a family." And him pacing, his frustration boiling over. "I told you, not now," he'd shouted, his hand jerking up in a flash of anger. He didn't hit her. He caught himself, his palms slamming into the wall instead, shoving her shoulder as he stormed past. But the force of it, the almost, was enough. She stumbled back, her breath hitching, and the look in her eyes wasn't anger but something worse. Resignation. The end came fast, a wound ripped open and left to bleed out. One grey morning she stood in the doorway with a suitcase, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. "Goodbye, Caspar," she said, her voice flat, final. He didn't stop her, didn't even try. She walked out and he turned back to his desk, burying himself in the next deal, the next step up. Success waited for no one. Years blurred past in a rush of triumphs. The business ballooned, his bank account swelled, and Theodora swept into his life like a perfectly timed acquisition. She was stunning, sharp-edged, a woman who'd inherited her grandfather's empire and wielded it with the same ruthless grace Caspar admired in himself. They fit together seamlessly, two forces of nature, ambition personified. Their life was a polished machine, galas, private jets, a mansion that screamed power. The wedding loomed ahead, a glittering capstone to his story of victory, a moment to stand atop the world he'd built and say, "I made it." And yet? Back in the office, the pre-dawn hush gave way to the first stirrings of the city. Lights winked on in distant windows, a new day creeping in with a new chapter he couldn't quite grasp. Caspar lingered over the photograph a moment longer, Penelope's frozen laugh staring back at him. His chest tightened, an ache he couldn't name, before he slid the picture into the drawer and shut it with a soft thud. The wedding venue shimmered like a jewel under the night sky, a sprawling crystal palace of glass and steel aglow with thousands of twinkling lights. The air buzzed with a festive hum, laughter spilling from the open terrace, the clink of champagne flutes, the rustle of silk gowns brushing against tailored suits. Every detail had been sculpted to perfection, an orchestration of elegance so flawless it could have doubled as a museum exhibit. Theodora moved through it all with the precision of a general before a campaign, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she inspected the preparations. She held a sleek menu catalogue in her hands, flipping through its pages with the same focus she'd give a quarterly report. Her polished fingers, nails gleaming with a fresh manicure, danced over the options, pausing here and there as she murmured to herself, She stopped on a page, tilting her head slightly as she studied it. "What do you think of this salmon with truffle sauce?" she asked, glancing up at Caspar, who stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets. Her voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, a test beneath the question. He nodded absently, his gaze drifting past her to the glittering chandeliers overhead, their light fracturing into 1,000 tiny stars. "Yeah," he said, his tone flat, detached. "Sounds good." Theodora's eyes narrowed, just for a moment, before she pressed on. "Caspar, are you listening to me?" Her words cut through the haze, sharper now, pulling him back to the moment. He blinked, turning to her with a practiced smile, the kind he'd perfected for boardrooms and investors. "Yes, of course," he said, smoothing his voice into something agreeable. "The salmon will be excellent." She studied him, her lips pursing slightly as if weighing his response, then nodded and returned to the catalogue, satisfied for now. Theodora was in her element here, every choice a brick in the monument of their union. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a statement, a merger of two powerhouses clad in white satin and black tie. Marriage to her was the logical next step, a seamless extension of his career's upward arc. She belonged to his world, the world of boardrooms and private clubs, where ambition was oxygen and status was currency. She understood the game, played it as well as he did, her calculating mind a perfect match for his own. Together they were unstoppable, a dynasty in the making. So why did his thoughts keep slipping away, tugging him back to Penelope? He shifted his weight, glancing out the towering windows at the city beyond, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the dark. The chatter of guests faded to a dull roar in his ears as her face flickered into his mind, unbidden, unwelcome. Penelope laughing in that old photo, her hair catching the sun. Penelope in that cafe, her voice breaking as she asked if his ambitions were worth their ruin. Penelope walking out the door, suitcase in hand, leaving a silence that had never really lifted. He clenched his jaw, trying to shake it off, but the memory clung like damp air, heavy and persistent. Theodora's voice cut through again, crisp and commanding. "Caspar, I need you to focus. The florist is asking about the centerpieces, orchids or lilies. What's your take?" She didn't look up this time, her pen poised over the catalogue, ready to mark her territory. "Orchids," he said automatically, forcing his attention back to her, to the room, to the life he'd chosen. "They're fine." She nodded, scribbling a note, oblivious to the war in his head. This was his future, glittering, precise, triumphant. Theodora was his partner, his equal, the woman who'd stand beside him as they conquered the world. But as the venue glowed around him, a hollow ache stirred beneath the polish, a whisper of something lost that no amount of truffle sauce or crystal could bury. In the soft glow of her cozy apartment, Penelope sat at her desk, the wedding invitation resting in front of her like an unopened letter bomb. The room was bathed in the warm light of mismatched lamps, their amber hues casting gentle shadows over the worn wooden floor and the overstuffed bookshelf in the corner. A faint hum of traffic filtered through the window, where she stared out at the stream of people below, their lives blurring into a quiet rhythm. She twirled the envelope between her fingers, her brow furrowed, a mix of surprise and unease fluttering in her chest. "Why am I reacting this way?" she wondered, her gaze drifting to the rain-streaked glass. It was just an invitation, elegant, impersonal, stamped with Caspar's name in gold foil. But seeing it had jolted her, her heart skipping as if it recognized something her mind hadn't yet caught up to. Memories surged in like a tide, his lopsided grin over late-night coffee, the way he'd paced their tiny apartment ranting about his dreams, the sting of his voice in that cafe years ago. On one hand, it was nothing. Her ex-husband was getting married, a footnote in a story she'd left behind. On the other, it was Caspar, the man who'd chosen ambition over her, over the family she'd longed for, inviting her to witness his triumph. The contradiction pulsed in her temples, a dull ache spreading as she wrestled with it. She reached for her phone, thumbing through her contacts until she landed on Juniper. The call connected on the second ring, and her best friend's familiar voice, warm, steady, a lifeline, crackled through. "Hey, Pen, what's up?" "I got an invitation to Casper's wedding," Penelope blurted, skipping the hello, her words tumbling out in a rush. There was a beat of silence, then Juniper's incredulous laugh. "What? Are you out of your mind?" She paused, softening. "To his wedding, huh? That's unexpected, to say the least." Penelope sighed, sinking back in her chair, the invitation still clutched in her hand. "Do you think I should go? I don't even know why I'm considering it. My head's a mess, Juniper. I can't stop thinking about him, about everything. I don't know what to do." "Listen," Juniper cut in, her tone shifting to something gentler, more deliberate. "You've got to figure out what matters to you. If there's something you need to say, something he should know, then maybe you go. But if it's just nostalgia dragging you back, Pen, you don't owe him that." Penelope nodded, even though Juniper couldn't see her, the words settling like a balm. "Thanks," she murmured. "I just needed to hear you say it." They chatted a little longer, Juniper's easy humour pulling a few reluctant smiles, before she hung up, the apartment falling quiet again. She set the phone down and stared at the invitation, her mind a battlefield. Why had he invited her? It didn't make sense. Casper wasn't sentimental, not the man she'd last known. Was it a flex, a chance to parade his success? Or something else? The question stirred old feelings, a tangle of hurt and curiosity she thought she'd buried. She rubbed her temples, the headache sharpening, and glanced toward the living room. There, sprawled on the rug with a scattering of crayons, was the one piece of this puzzle Casper didn't know existed. He was humming softly as she scribbled a lopsided house. She exhaled sharply, a sudden clarity slicing through the chaos. "Screw it," she muttered under her breath, tossing the invitation onto the desk. She'd go. She'd face him, see this new life he'd built, and maybe, finally, close the chapter for good. The wedding hall of the Crystal Palace glittered like a dream caught in glass, its towering chandeliers spilling soft, prismatic light across the room. Elegantly set tables gleamed with silver and crystal, surrounded by floral arrangements that perfumed the air with notes of jasmine and rose. Casper stood near the altar, a vision in his impeccable white suit, the fabric tailored to accentuate his broad shoulders and commanding presence. Outwardly, he was the picture of a triumphant groom, polished, poised, the king of his own empire. But beneath the crisp lines of his attire, a storm churned. His pulse thrummed in his ears, each tick of the clock a test of his resolve as he stole glances at the entrance. Penelope was coming. He could feel it, a pull he couldn't shake. Theodora, resplendent in a couture gown that hugged her like liquid starlight, stood a few paces away, murmuring to a cluster of her friends. The dress, crafted by a designer whose name alone could open doors, draped her in an aura of untouchable elegance, its train shimmering with every subtle move. Her voice was light, her laughter practiced, but her cold, assessing gaze roamed the room intermittently, sizing up the guests with the precision of a hawk. She, too, awaited Penelope, her lips curling faintly at the thought of her arrival, imagining some drab, outdated dress, a perfect foil to her own splendor. Then the doors swung open, and Penelope stepped in. She didn't slink or shuffle. She entered with a quiet majesty, her head high, her stride steady. She wore a tailored grey suit, sharp and understated, its clean lines accentuating her lean frame and radiating a strength that needed no embellishment. The room seemed to pause, a ripple of attention following her, but Casper's eyes locked on her instantly, and then slid to the small figure at her side. A boy no more than 6 stood beside her, his dark hair tousled, his features striking in their familiarity. He clutched her hand, peering around with wide, curious eyes. Casper's breath caught, a tremor running through him as if the ground had shifted. The chatter of the hall faded into a strange, suspended silence, the guests sensing the undercurrent of tension that crackled in the air. "Penelope," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper as he stepped forward. "You're not alone." She met his gaze, her expression calm but alive with an ocean of unspoken emotions, triumph flickering at the edges, pain buried deeper. "No," she replied simply, her tone even but weighted. "I'm not." The boy, Tyler she called him, tilted his head up at Casper, his stare open and unguarded. There was something in those eyes, in the curve of his jaw, the shape of his nose, that struck Casper like a blow. His heart stuttered, recognition dawning in a rush he couldn't name yet. "This is Tyler," Penelope said, her voice cutting through the haze, brief but deliberate. Her hand rested on the boy's head, smoothing his hair in a gesture so tender it sent an ache spiraling through Casper's chest. Theodora, who'd been watching from afar, glided closer, her gown whispering against the floor. Her eyes narrowed slightly, flickering between Penelope and the child, with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Who is Tyler?" she asked, her voice cool and measured, though a thread of unease laced it. She stopped beside Casper, her presence a silent demand for answers. Casper didn't speak. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on Tyler, drinking in every detail, the way his brow furrowed slightly, the faint dimple in his cheek, the mirror of his own face staring back at him. A premonition crept into his soul, cold and electric, whispering truths he wasn't ready to face. The hall, with all its festive brilliance, seemed to shrink around them, the lights dimming at the edges as the weight of the moment pressed in. Penelope's hand lingered on Tyler's head, her touch a shield and a statement, and in that simple act, Casper felt the ground he'd built his life on begin to crack. The hall hung in a taut, breathless silence. Guests stood motionless, their champagne flutes forgotten, their murmurs stilled by the unspoken weight of the moment. Eyes darted between Casper, Penelope, and the small boy at her side, sensing the gravity of something unspoken unfolding before them. And there was Tyler, unflinching under the scrutiny, his gaze fixed on Casper with a child's fearless curiosity. His presence, small but undeniable, cut through the tension like a blade, dismantling walls Casper hadn't even known he'd built. Time seemed to halt, the chandelier's light softening into a haze as the world narrowed to this single point. Casper's eyes traced the boy's face, his breath shallow as something stirred deep within, a flicker of instinct, a premonition he couldn't name but felt in his bones. Tyler stood steady, a little stiff but unafraid, his dark brown eyes catching the light in a way that stopped Casper cold. They were his eyes, his own, mirrored back at him with a clarity that made his chest tighten. The boy's suit, a miniature version of elegance with its crisp lines and carefully knotted tie, spoke of Penelope's quiet pride, her deliberate care. Theodora sensed the shift in Casper before anyone else did. Her perfectly styled hair gleamed under the lights, her flawless makeup a mask of composure, but her posture stiffened as she registered the crack in his armor. She stepped closer, her heels clicking a measured staccato against the marble, each sound a demand for control in a moment slipping from her grasp. "What's going on here?" she whispered, her voice low and urgent as she gripped his hand, her nails pressing into his skin. But Casper didn't flinch, didn't respond. His world had tunneled to Tyler, to those familiar eyes, and Theodora's words faded into the ether. Penelope stood resolute beside her son, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, a shield, a tether. Her grey suit framed her with quiet dignity, but Casper caught the faint tremble in her fingers, a ripple beneath her calm exterior. "Who is this boy?" he asked, his voice steady but strained, as if testing the weight of the question before it left his lips. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze held his, unwavering, a storm of emotions swirling behind it, resolve, pain, a trace of something like defiance. The silence stretched, taut and electric, as Tyler tilted his head slightly, still watching Casper with that open, unguarded stare. "This is my son, Tyler," Penelope said again, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel. The hall fell into a stunned hush, the festive air evaporating as every eye turned to the unfolding scene. The guests, moments ago poised to toast a union, now leaned forward, caught in the grip of a drama they hadn't anticipated. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a rising tide, soft but insistent, weaving a web of speculation. "Tyler," Casper echoed, the name tasting foreign yet achingly familiar on his tongue. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on the boy, then flicked back to Penelope. "And who is his father?" His voice was low, pressing, a plea wrapped in a demand. Penelope held his gaze, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, but her lips pressed into a thin line, guarding the truth like a fortress. She exhaled, a quiet surrender, and looked down at Tyler for a moment before lifting her gaze back to him. "He's your son," she said, the words dropping like a stone into still water. Her eyes fell, unable to hold his any longer, as if the weight of the confession had drained her. The impact hit Casper like a physical blow, the air rushing out of him as the ground seemed to buckle. He staggered back a half step, his hand grasping at nothing. Theodora's gasp cut through the silence, sharp and ragged, her composure fracturing. Mascara streaked down her cheeks as she whipped her head from Penelope to Casper, her perfect wedding mask crumbling. "What?" she breathed, her voice a thread of disbelief and fury. "Why didn't you tell me?" Casper asked, his voice breaking, raw with a desperation he couldn't mask. "You were too busy to notice anything but your business," Penelope replied, her tone even but laced with an old, quiet pain. She looked at him then, her eyes piercing through the years between them. "I tried, Casper. A few weeks after the divorce, I called you. I wanted you to know I was pregnant, but you wouldn't even hear me out. You thought I was just trying to pull you back, and you shut me down before I could say it." He remembered those calls. Curt dismissals, his voice clipped over the line. "Pen, we're done. Let it go." He'd been neck-deep in a new deal, adrenaline pumping, no room for her in his world. The realization sank into him like a blade, twisting deeper. He'd built his empire on choices, on sacrifices, but this was a cost he'd never seen coming. Theodora's laughter erupted like a shard of glass, shattering the tension, high and jagged, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Is this some kind of joke?" she spat, her voice rising over the stunned murmurs of the guests. "Today is my wedding day." And suddenly a child appears. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest, her meticulously crafted plan, to wield this day as a weapon, to diminish Penelope in front of everyone, collapsing into dust before her eyes. Her laughter faded into a brittle, disbelieving scoff, her gaze darting between Casper and the boy, searching for a crack in the reality unfolding. But Casper wasn't listening. His world had narrowed to Tyler, the small figure standing calm and unshaken amid the chaos. The boy's dark eyes met his, steady and curious, untouched by the storm swirling around them. The boy's features, so achingly familiar, reflected back at him, a mirror of everything he'd walked away from. "Why?" he choked out, the word ragged, desperate. "Why didn't you tell me?" Penelope's silence held for a beat longer, her lips trembling as she fought to keep her composure. Then, through her own tears, she spoke, her voice low but cutting. "Do you think I didn't want to tell you that you had a son?" She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, her gaze locking onto his with a fire he hadn't seen in years. "You're only asking this now that you have everything you ever wanted. Back then, you didn't care enough to listen." The words struck him like a hammer, splintering the fragile pride he'd clung to. He had it all, the wealth, the power, the penthouse view, and yet, staring at Tyler, at Penelope's tear-streaked face, he saw it for what it was, a hollow empire. He'd achieved everything he'd chased, only to realize he'd traded away something irreplaceable. His knees weakened, and he pressed a hand to his mouth, stifling a sob as the weight of it crashed over him. Tyler shifted beside Penelope, his wide brown eyes flicking up to her. Curiosity had given way to something softer, a flicker of concern as he watched his mother cry, something he'd never witnessed before. Penelope's tears were rare, carefully hidden in the quiet of countless nights, locked away where Tyler's innocent world couldn't reach. But now they fell freely, silent and steady, and she made no move to hide them. She stroked his hair gently, a small anchor in the storm, as the hall remained suspended in the aftermath of her words, the truth laid bare for all to see. The hall plunged into a stunned, absolute silence, the kind that swallowed sound and left only the weight of what had just unfolded. The guests, poised moments ago to raise their glasses in celebration, stood frozen, their faces a gallery of shock and fascination as they watched a wedding transform into a raw, unscripted drama. The stillness shattered as Theodora's laughter erupted again, jagged and unhinged, slicing through the quiet like a blade. "This is a disgrace," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "How can you right now, on our wedding day, put on such a show?" Her hands clenched into fists, her gown shimmering incongruously as her perfect facade cracked wide open. Penelope didn't respond. She brushed the last of her tears away with a steady hand, her composure returning like a tide smoothing over sand. She glanced down at Tyler, offering him a small, tender smile, a quiet reassurance amid the chaos. Then, without a word, she took his hand, her grip firm but gentle, and turned toward the exit. Her grey suit caught the light as she moved, a symbol of her resolve, her steps deliberate as she walked away from the wreckage. "Tyler!" Casper's voice broke through the air, raw and desperate, a cry that echoed off the crystal walls. He clutched his head, tears streaming down his face as he stumbled forward a step, reaching for something he couldn't grasp. Tyler paused, his small frame half-turned as he walked, his dark eyes flicking back to Casper with a mix of curiosity and confusion. He didn't understand. Not the tears, not the tension, not the weight of the moment, but he looked anyway, caught between his mother's steady pull and the stranger calling his name. Penelope didn't stop. She pushed through the doors and out into the cool night, the sounds of the hall fading behind her. She'd done it. Closed the chapter she'd left dangling for 6 years. She'd always wanted Tyler to know his father, to bridge that gap, but never like this, not in the glare of chandeliers and the gasp of a crowd. Yet, here they were, fate's messy hand at play, and she accepted it with a weary shrug. She wasn't proud of how it had unfolded, showing up, letting the truth spill out in front of everyone. But she didn't berate herself either. It was done. They climbed into her modest sedan, the engine humming softly as they pulled away from the Crystal Palace. The city lights streaked past, a blur of gold and shadow, and the silence between them was gentle, almost companionable. Tyler fidgeted in the back seat, his small hands twisting the edge of his suit jacket. Finally, his voice piped up, timid but insistent. "Mum, why were you crying? And who was that man? Was he... my dad?" Penelope's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her breath catching as she glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His wide eyes met hers, searching, already piecing together a truth he couldn't fully grasp. She softened, her voice steady but warm as she began. "Sometimes things happen in adults' lives that are complicated, Ty. And yeah, that man. He's your dad. This wasn't how I wanted you to meet him, but it's what happened today." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We'll talk more about it, okay? I promise." He nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he turned to stare out the window, the city sliding by. It was the start of something new between them, the first of many serious conversations about the father he'd only just glimpsed. For Penelope, the drive home was a quiet release, a shedding of old weight as she steered them toward the life she'd built alone, one that, for better or worse, now carried the echo of this night. Back at the Crystal Palace, the stunned silence gradually unraveled into a murmur of hushed conversations, the wedding teetering back onto its rails like a derailed train righted by sheer will. The guests resumed their seats, their whispers a quiet undercurrent as the ceremony pressed forward. Caspar stood at the altar, his white suit pristine, his face a mask of composure he'd honed through years of boardroom battles. He recited his vows, shook hands, smiled for photos, but inside he was a hollow shell, his pulse a dull thud against the wreckage of his emotions. Each glance from the crowd felt like a spotlight on a wound he couldn't hide. Theodora, too, was adrift. She glided through the motions, cutting the cake, toasting with champagne, her gown still radiant, her posture impeccable. But the cracks showed in the tightness of her smile, the way her eyes darted away from Caspar's. The guests saw it despite her efforts. Her iron facade couldn't fully mask the tremor beneath. In the days and weeks that followed, an uneasy calm settled over their lives. The newlyweds retreated to their mansion, but the air between them was thick with unspoken weight. Caspar withdrew, spending hours by the window, staring out at the city's cold expanse, or letting mournful piano notes drift from the speakers. Chopin, Satie, anything that matched the ache he couldn't name. He barely ate, his frame thinning as he sank deeper into himself, replaying that moment with Tyler over and over. Theodora gave him space at first, her own pride and discipline keeping her at a distance. She buried herself in work, her heels clicking through the house as she barked orders into her phone. But his silence grew heavier, his untouched plates piling up, and one afternoon she couldn't ignore it anymore. She found him in the living room, slumped in an armchair, gazing blankly at the horizon. "Hey," she said softly, her voice gentler than usual. An olive branch extended into the void. He didn't respond, didn't even turn. She opened her mouth, the words, "It's time to let it go," hovering on her tongue, sharp and practical as ever. But something stopped her. Maybe the slump of his shoulders, maybe the memory of her own unraveling at the wedding. She swallowed the advice, turned on her heel, and retreated to her room. The door clicked shut behind her, the lock sliding into place with a quiet finality. Alone, Theodora, the iron woman who'd forged herself into a fortress, crumbled. She pressed a pillow to her face, muffling the sobs that tore through her raw and unrestrained. Tears soaked the fabric as she let go, the weight of everything, her pride, her plans, her perfect life, spilling out. She reached for the vodka on her nightstand, the bottle half empty by the time exhaustion claimed her. She fell asleep in a tangle of sheets, mascara streaking her cheeks, the storm within her spent. When she woke, the afternoon sun pierced through the curtains, casting warm stripes across the room. Surprisingly, she felt lighter, her head clear despite the faint throb of a hangover. Something had shifted in the night, a crack in her armor, a release she hadn't expected. She stood before the mirror for a long time, studying her reflection. The woman staring back was still Theodora, sharp cheekbones, steely eyes, but softer somehow, unguarded. She traced the lines of her face, realizing how hardened she'd become, how closed off. Years of ambition, of shielding herself from vulnerability, had their reasons, losses she'd buried, fears she'd armored against, but they'd left her brittle. And now this. That afternoon she hesitated, a rare sensation for her. Not out of difficulty, but because it was unfamiliar, uncharted. She traded her tailored suits for jeans and a simple sweater, grabbed her keys, and drove. An hour later, she sat in her car outside an old apartment complex, the address scribbled on a scrap of paper clutched in her hand. She waited, the engine off, the silence pressing in. Then she saw them, Penelope and Tyler strolling down the sidewalk hand in hand. Penelope's voice carried faintly, animated and warm, as she gestured with her free hand, telling Tyler something that made him grin. They moved at an easy pace, unhurried, a little world of their own. Theodora watched from behind the tinted glass, her chest tightening as a fresh wave of tears welled up. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling the sound, and let them fall. The sight of them, so simple, so connected, pierced her in a way she hadn't anticipated, unraveling the last threads of the woman she'd thought she was. With a sudden surge of resolve, Theodora pushed open the car door and stepped out, her sneakers scuffing against the pavement as she approached Penelope and Tyler just as they reached the entrance of the apartment complex. "Penelope!" she called, her voice firm but edged with something softer, something vulnerable. Penelope spun around, her eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing as her brows knit together. "How dare you show up here like this?" she snapped, her voice sharp with indignation, her hand tightening around Tyler's. Theodora raised her hands quickly, palms out, her posture shrinking slightly in a way that felt foreign to her. "Please, I don't mean any harm," she said, her tone low and earnest, almost pleading. I need to apologize for everything." Penelope's chest heaved, anger flaring hot and bright, her breath coming in short, furious bursts. But then she caught Theodora's eyes, red-rimmed, glistening with unshed tears, brimming with a raw, unguarded desperation. "Please," Theodora whispered again, her voice breaking. The air hung heavy between them, charged with years of unspoken tension. Penelope stared into those eyes, searching, wrestling with her fury, until finally she gave a single silent nod. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. They walked into the apartment in silence, the creak of the stairs the only sound as they climbed to Penelope's unit. Inside, the warm glow of lamps bathed the cozy space, a stark contrast to the sterile elegance of Theodora's world. Penelope turned to Tyler, her voice softening. "Hey, bud, go to your room for a bit, okay? Mom needs to talk." He nodded, casting a curious glance at Theodora before scampering off, his footsteps fading down the hall. The two women stood in the small living room, the air thick with awkwardness. Theodora shifted her weight, her hands twisting together as she searched for words. I don't even know where to start," she began, her voice halting. "I'm sorry for the wedding, for wanting to humiliate you. I was so caught up in my own game. I didn't see what it would do." Penelope crossed her arms, her expression guarded but softening as Theodora pressed on. "I've realized something these past weeks," Theodora said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've become someone I don't even recognize anymore, hard, closed off. It wasn't always like this." She paused, swallowing hard, then looked up. You're the happiest woman in the world, Penelope." Penelope's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. Theodora let the silence stretch for a moment before adding, her voice barely above a whisper, "Because you're a mother." Tears spilled over then, and she didn't fight them, letting them trail down her cheeks as she sank onto the edge of the couch. 10 years ago, I found out I can't have children," she said, her words trembling. "A rare condition, nothing could be done. I wanted them so badly, my own kids, but that dream, it died, and over time, it turned me into this." Penelope sat across from her, her anger giving way to a quiet, reluctant empathy as Theodora's story poured out. "I never loved Casper," Theodora admitted, her voice raw. "Not really. I didn't need his businesses or his expertise, I had my own. What I needed was his ambition, his drive, his willingness to sacrifice family for success. I thought he was like me, that he'd never want kids either. I never told him I couldn't have them. He didn't ask, didn't care, until he did." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a bitter laugh escaping. "No matter how much wealth you pile up, it wears thin. Sooner or later, you crave something simple, something real. I saw it in him that day, and it broke everything I'd built." As Theodora's words hung in the air, a quiet clarity settled over Penelope. The pieces clicked into place. It wasn't just pride or spite driving her, it was a deeper wound, a raw envy she'd armored herself against. Theodora couldn't stand the happiness of others who had what she'd never have, the simple, profound joy of being a parent. The realization softened the last of Penelope's anger, replacing it with a pang of understanding, tinged with sorrow for the woman sitting across from her, stripped bare by her own confession. When Theodora's voice trailed off, her story laid bare, Penelope began nodding slowly, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement blooming in the quiet. For the first time, she felt a flicker of appreciation. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of the courage it took to come here, to peel back the layers and expose such a raw truth. Penelope wasn't one to cling to grudges. They weighed too much, and she'd carried enough already. She let out a soft sigh, the tension easing from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice low but genuine, "for telling me." A hush settled over the room, thick and contemplative. They sat there, Penelope on her worn couch, Theodora perched stiffly across from her, their eyes drifting anywhere but to each other. The faint hum of the city seeped through the walls, a distant reminder of the world moving on outside. Then Theodora broke the silence, her tone quieter now, almost hesitant. "Casper's not doing well," she said, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "It's because of Tyler. He's lost. He was so blinded by everything he built. And now he's seeing it too late." Penelope's gaze flickered to the hallway where Tyler's room lay, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Theodora lingered for a moment longer, the weight of her own words pressing down on her. Theodora left. Theodora's words lingered in Penelope's mind like a stubborn echo, reverberating through her thoughts in the days that followed. She wrestled with the idea of Casper seeing Tyler, deserving it even. Resentment still simmered, a bitter fog clouding her judgment, but beneath it, a small, persistent voice tugged at her, whispering that Tyler's father deserved a chance, however slim, to know his son. It gnawed at her peace, keeping her awake at night as she weighed the past against the present. A few days later, she broached the subject with Tyler, her tone light and careful, brushing over it like a painter testing a canvas. "What do you think about your dad?" she asked, watching his face as he shrugged, his answers vague but curious, a child's openness tempering her own guarded heart. Weeks later, she found herself standing before the towering gates of Casper's mansion, Tyler's hand warm in hers. The decision had crystallized the night before, after hours of pacing her apartment, until she'd picked up the phone and dialed Theodora. The call was brief, tentative, but Theodora's voice had been steady, even kind. Now, as the door swung open, Theodora greeted them with a smile, small, genuine, a far cry from the icy elegance Penelope remembered. She led them inside, the mansion's vastness swallowing their footsteps, then crouched down to Tyler's level, her eyes softening. "Hi, Tyler," she said modestly, extending a hand. "I'm Theodora. Want to shake on it?" He grinned, taking her hand with a shy nod. She straightened, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your dad's been really sad lately because he wants to see you again, but he knows your mum's upset with him. So today we're going to surprise him. How's that sound?" Tyler's face lit up, his smile wide and eager, and he bobbed his head in agreement. They moved through the house, the air thick with anticipation, until they reached a spacious room where Casper sat, slouched on a leather couch, aimlessly flipping through TV channels. His shirt was rumpled, his eyes dull, the remote moving mechanically in his hand, a man trying to drown his thoughts in noise. Tyler stepped forward, plopping down beside him without hesitation. Casper's head turned slowly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Then he glanced up and saw Penelope and Theodora framed in the doorway. Penelope gave a single quiet nod, her expression unreadable but resolute. Casper fumbled with the remote, his fingers shaky as he scrolled through channels, landing on one with bright, familiar cartoons. Tyler's eyes sparked with recognition, a grin tugging at his lips as he leaned forward. Casper cleared his throat, his voice halting at first, careful not to stumble. Hey, you like this one, huh? What's this guy's name? He asked, nodding at a goofy character bouncing across the screen. Tyler launched into an animated explanation, his small voice filling the room with chatter about cartoon heroes and their antics. Casper listened, nodding along, a tentative smile breaking through the haze of his grief. It was awkward, fragile, the first thread of a connection weaving between them, but it was a start. Penelope watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her heart a tangle of relief and unease. Theodora stood beside her, silent, a quiet witness to the beginning of something neither of them could fully predict. Casper's reconnection with the son he'd only just begun to know. The visits between Casper and Tyler had become a steady rhythm over the months, each one weaving a fragile but strengthening bond. Penelope observed from the sidelines, her heart a battlefield of caution and reluctant hope. Casper wasn't the man she'd walked away from 6 years ago, cold, consumed by ambition. There was a softness in him now, a quiet remorse that showed in the way he listened to Tyler's wild stories, the way his eyes lingered on their son with unspoken promises. One crisp autumn afternoon, after Tyler had roped Casper into a leaf pile war in the park, Penelope made her choice. She invited Casper into her small kitchen, the scent of cinnamon tea lingering as she set 2 mugs on the table. "You can see him whenever you want," she said, her voice steady but tinged with finality. "He needs you in his life. And I think you need him too." Casper's breath hitched, his hands tightening around the mug as tears welled in his eyes. "Penelope, Thank you," he stammered, his voice raw. "I know I don't deserve this, but I'll do right by him. By you." She nodded, not fully trusting yet, but enough to let this chapter close, for Tyler's sake and for her own peace. Back at the mansion, Casper found Theodora in the study, her laptop open but untouched, her gaze lost in the distance. He leaned against the doorframe, a faint smile breaking through his weariness. "You made this happen, Theo," he said, his tone warm and earnest. "You gave me my son back. Thank you." For Penelope, the decision to let Casper in marked the end of a long-held tether. She spent the next few weeks lighter, untangling herself from the past. One evening, as Tyler hummed over a puzzle at the kitchen table, she called Juniper. "I'm done carrying it," she said, her voice firm. "He's Tyler's dad, not my ghost anymore. I'm moving on." Juniper laughed, a sound of relief, and they planned a weekend away, just the 2 of them, a reset. Penelope hung up, glancing at Tyler, and felt the closure settle in. A quiet, hard-won freedom to build her own life, unshackled from what might have been. Meanwhile, Casper and Theodora's relationship began to evolve, tentative at first, then blooming in unexpected ways. Late-night talks about Tyler turned into shared confessions, his regrets, her buried pain, and a closeness neither had anticipated. Theodora saw a new side of Casper, the father who grinned at Tyler's silly jokes, the man who lingered over a cup of coffee with a tenderness she'd never known he possessed. It stirred her, this warmth, and she found herself falling, not for the titan she'd partnered with, but for the human he'd uncovered. One night, under a sky pricked with stars, he caught her staring, his grin playful. "What's that look?" he teased, and she laughed, her hand finding his, a spark igniting where ambition once ruled. The idea of adoption slipped into their lives one Sunday morning as Tyler's laughter from a sleepover still echoed in the halls. Theodora set her coffee down, her voice hesitant but resolute. "What if we adopted? A baby, maybe? Someone to make this ours?" Casper's eyes widened, the newspaper forgotten as he processed her words. Then he grinned, bright and unguarded. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "I'd love that." They threw themselves into it, forms, interviews, a nursery painted soft blue, their partnership shifting from strategy to shared hope. Penelope, informed through a casual call from Casper, gave her blessing with a quiet smile. Tyler'll love being a big brother, she said, and meant it, her heart steady now, her own path clear. When the call came, a baby boy 4 months old ready for a home, Casper and Theodora stood in the nursery, arms around each other, tears mingling with laughter. The day they brought Ethan home, Tyler was there peering into the crib with wide-eyed awe. "He's tiny," he whispered, and Casper ruffled his hair, pride swelling in his chest. Theodora cradled Ethan, her tough exterior dissolving as she pressed a kiss to his forehead, love filling the spaces she'd once guarded so fiercely. Penelope stopped by later that week, dropping Tyler off for a visit. She stood in the doorway watching Casper bounce Ethan while Tyler chattered about cartoon villains, Theodora laughing softly beside them. It was a scene she'd never imagined, messy, imperfect, complete. She smiled, a weight lifting as she turned to leave, closure a quiet companion at her side. Her life was hers now, unshaded by the past, ready for whatever came next. For Casper and Theodora, this patchwork family, Tyler, Ethan, and the love they'd stumbled into wasn't what they'd planned. It was better. A home built not on ambition, but on second chances, where each of them, in their own way, had found a place to belong.